Of course, next year marks the 50th anniversary of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was created to improve academic achievement for the nation's most disadvantaged students and schools. But as we know, Congress has attempted to reauthorize the act, but it is unclear when that may happen in the near future. Next year also marks the 50th anniversary of the Compact for Education, which created ECS. It was a historic agreement. All 50 states and territories created the kind of think tank that we have here today of sharing of the education policies. And if it weren't for that agreement 49 years ago, we wouldn't be here today. In fact, governors were among the leading proponents for the Compact for Education. It was at the annual meeting in July of 1965 the governors passed a resolution to support the Compact for Education and its focus on collaboration and the sharing of ideas across the states. Since that time, we are extremely fortunate that governors have continued to play an important role in our future. Every year at the National Forum, we gather several governors to talk about a variety of important issues, and this year is no different. I would like to introduce the panelists for our next plenary session, which will be dealing with the important issues around civic education. You all know our chair, Governor Brian Sandoval, who talks about his work with ECS, but it's also important to note that he is the current vice chair of the Western Governors Association, and he's also vice chair of the National Governors Association Education and Workforce Committee. He has no problem jumping onto national groups and trying to lead in the education realm and continues to promote the civic education that is important. We also have joining us Governor Steve Bullock of Montana, and we are so pleased that he will be our ECS chair-elect for the next year. Governor Bullock actually served as the former Montana Attorney General, and as the father of 3 young children, he has made education and civic engagement a priority during his term. And our moderator for this plenary session is Michelle Herczog. Dr. Herczog is the president of the National Council for the Social Studies, the largest association in the nation devoted solely to social studies education. She also serves on the California Task Force on K-12 civic learning. With that, I'd like to welcome the 2 governors and Michelle to the stage, and we can go ahead and begin the next plenary session.
That's fun. I'll be here. That's fun. Okay. Good to see you. Well, thank you. And before we start, I want to certainly thank the Education Commission of the States for inviting us to this forum to have this conversation, to be sure that the social studies is not marginalized in K-12 education, that it is a fundamental core subject, and there's nothing more important than preparing our students, not just for college and career, but also for effective civic life. And so I thank you for including us on this agenda and being here today. I want to open with a quote, and this is from Justice David Souter from the Harvard Symposium at Harvard Law School, and I think it'll help frame our conversation really well. Justice Souter said, "There are conditions, historical and contemporary, that drive us apart and tend to disunite us. What have we got pulling on the other side? By and large, what we have pulling on the other side is an adherence to our American constitutional system. The American Constitution is not simply a blueprint for structure, though it is that. It's not merely a Bill of Rights, though it is that too. It is, in essence, a value system. We need to teach that we have a value system, and the one common value system that we can claim to have in the United States is the constitutional value system, a system that identifies the legitimate objects of power, the importance of distributing power, and the need to limit power by a shared and enforceable conception of human worth. That value system is the counterpoise to the divisive tendencies that are so strong today, and civic ignorance is its enemy. It is beyond me how anyone can assume that our system of constitutional values is going to survive in the current divisive atmosphere while being unknown to the majority of the people of these United States. So what is driving me right now is simply the indispensability of our increasingly unrecognized and ignored constitutional value system. Without it, there is no chance of overcoming, of surviving the polarization that everyone decries. It is only in the common acceptance of that value system that at the end of the day, no matter what we are fighting about, no matter what the vote is in Congress or the State House or the town meeting, we will still understand that something holds us together. Ultimately, what is driving me in working for the renewal of civic education is the need to share the threatened aspirations that should mark us as a people who belong together as a nation. This is, ladies and gentlemen, is our civic mission for schools. We're hearing so much about preparing students for college and career. Before anyone in this room was born, public education was born to prepare young people to be engaged and effective citizens in their community. High school graduation speeches abound about students wanting to change the world. If we prepare them for college, that will benefit them. If we prepare them for careers, it will benefit them. But I ask you, what is our intention in preparing them with the skills and knowledge they need to prepare and make the world around them a better place? And we think civic learning is key to realizing that. So we're going to start with a few slides. That's the cue. There you go. Because unfortunately, the news is not good about civic learning. The most recent NAEP assessment on civic learning, and you're seeing some of the data here, is showing very low numbers of students' civic knowledge that they placed on this test has remained relatively flat over the years. And on the next slide, you see even more daunting data that there we go. You see even more daunting data which shows from the last 2010 assessment that 2/3 of all students are performing below proficient in their knowledge of civics, American government, how our system of democracy works, its history, and why it's important. More than 2/3 are below proficient. And if you dig into that data a little deeper and you look at the research conducted by Joseph Kahn and Mira Levinson at Harvard, you'll find that there's disproportionate numbers of many underrepresented groups. Students of color, students low income, are performing at much lower levels than their counterparts. So then it raises the question of not only gaps, but civic education, civic opportunity gaps. Which groups of students have opportunities to develop the civic knowledge, skills, and dispositions they need to be engaged in our American democracy? Which groups do not? Which groups will have the power? Which groups will not? So these are some of the many issues that we are here to discuss. And so I have a few questions for our governors, and just so pleased that they're here as part of this conversation. You've obviously both dedicated your life to public service, and we know in all of our times in our lives, there's a tipping point where we've decided what we wanted to do with our careers in our lives. So tell us a little bit about that moment for each of you when you decided to devote your life to public service. And then the next question would be, how can we recreate that moment for young people if they don't get it even out of school, but even in school? So thank you both for sharing your thoughts.
I remember it like it was yesterday. I was sitting at my kitchen table and I'd just poured the Lucky Charms, and on came, I'm just a bill, and I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. For generationally, that would be grammar and American rock, schoolhouse rock, which we no longer see anymore, I guess, or my kids don't. I think asking an elected official sort of what was it that drove them almost requires psychoanalysis and a couch. I've given a thought. Certainly, there were moments in high school where, Mr. Armstrong would start each class talking about current events, or Mrs. Christensen, my government teacher. Certainly, it was extracurricular activities, if we're talking about what was formative, from a youth in government or otherwise. I meet with we have pages that come for a week long, and I meet with them each new group. And I talk about, though, it was, I guess, my first break from college. I volunteered for asked the state legislator, can I just help you out for about a month? Because I have a month. And she said, sure. So I carried her coffee and things. And at one point I was grousing about how this was sort of a nation at risk time where everybody was talking about what needed to be done with schools, but nobody had ever asked a student. So she said, well, write a resolution. So wrote a resolution about student representation on local boards of education. It passed. It didn't change the world, but it demonstrated to me at a young age that this is more than just Schoolhouse Rock. You can get involved. You can make a distinction. When I decided, I guess, commit myself to public service, I was a baby lawyer in the Attorney General's office. This was a few years after law school, and was standing up in court saying, you know, this case about stream access. And my name's Steve Bullock. I represent the people of Montana. The streams to fish and enjoy belong to us and only us alone. It's such an amazing experience that I said someday I'd actually like to be the Attorney General. So ran for Attorney General, ran for governor.
That's wonderful. Great. Thank you for sharing. And how about you for you?
No, and thank you. And it's a great opportunity to sit on this panel. And listening to the governor, I think about my experiences, and I am old enough to remember Schoolhouse Rock as well. But I grew up, neither of my parents were college graduates, and we lived on a small ranch, and we raised sheep. And my first job was cleaning sheep pens, and I like to kid with people now that it was good practice for what I do now. But in any event, as I think back, I never dreamed that I'd be sitting here where I am today. I know when I was young that it was incomprehensible to me that I would be able to serve as my state's governor someday. But I did have a great love for government. I used to love to do reports on presidents and American history. And as things evolved, probably that I got involved in student government in elementary school and in high school. And when I was in college, I got an opportunity to intern for Paul Laxalt, who was a United States Senator here in Washington, D.C. And it's interesting because I talked to him later on and I asked him, well, why did you choose me? I wasn't remarkable. And he said, because you raise sheep. Because he was a sheep herder. His family was, and that, and watching him and seeing what he had done as a governor and as U.S. Senator for Nevada, it really inspired me. And so I was fortunate enough to be elected to the state legislature and serve 2 terms. I had a very positive experience there and went on to serve as a gaming commissioner in my state that oversees the gaming industry, and then served as the Attorney General of Nevada. And President Bush thereafter appointed me to the federal bench. And I served as a federal judge and gave that up to run for governor. And so I've had a very blessed life, but there's just been this internal fire to try to make a difference. I'm sure they have Boys State in Montana, and I go to talk to the Boys State and the Girls State and see them and their civic engagement and the potential leaders of tomorrow, and it makes me want to work even harder.
It's amazing to think about where you are now. And when I was so taken by the number of hands that went up about first generation college, so many of us in this room can just probably have that same feeling. Can't believe I'm here right now. And of course, we know that every student we touch isn't going to devote their careers to public service, but we of course want all of them to understand and appreciate it. So even if they don't have a tipping point like you did to go into politics, what can we do in schools to provide that opportunity to at least give them the feeling that they're part of democracy, they can be part of it, they can engage in it? How do we recreate a message like that?
It's very important to me to visit schools. Since I've become governor, I've visited over 200 schools, grade schools, middle schools, high schools. But one of those fundamental civic responsibilities is to vote. And so one of my favorite exercises that I like to do when I visit a classroom is this. So for example, let's say I have a class of 30 children. I'll tell them all to stand up. And so they'll all stand, and I said, I'm going to wave the magic wand, and you're all 18, and you're eligible to vote. And they're all happy. But then I'll tell them, well, half of you, I need you to sit down because you are old enough to vote, but you didn't register to vote. So half of them sit down, and there are 15 left. Well, for example, in Nevada, a few weeks ago, we had our primary elections, and I'm not proud of the fact that there was only a 20% turnout. So I visited a school right after that, and so I had the 15 sit down, and then I had 15 still standing. Well, I told all of them to sit down except for 3 of them. And then I told one of them to sit down, and I tell them, you see those 2 kids that are standing up? They're choosing for you who's going to represent you. So that is why your vote matters. So that's one of the small examples for me that I try to go out to start to get the kids interested. I mean, another thing that's important for me is to get the students to join, to belong to something. And another one of my favorite things to do is to judge We the People, where they go out and they practice perhaps testifying in front of a congressional committee. They learn about the Constitution, those types of things. I used to preside over moot court as a judge, and you see the kids participate in the judicial process and arguing their case before a jury. So I think that's a big piece of it, is getting kids to join and to belong and to learn actively.
And create those opportunities for them, absolutely. Governor Bullock.
I think there's certain obligations in the classroom. I mean, a discussion of current events at least makes our children feel more attached to what's happening and can actually start to have some of those discussions. And I think we'll talk some about curriculum and things like that. Be it a We the People, where it was one of our former teachers of the year in Montana that's really pushing that along. My lieutenant governor, who's a board certified teacher, I just appointed her earlier this year, really got involved with iCivics along with the superintendent. She got to, her high school class got to argue a case in front of Sandra Day O'Connor. We need to provide for those opportunities in the class, but also to try to make a connection with kids, be it either with the governors or with something beyond their classroom, and recognize that not only does it impact them, but they can have an effect upon it.
Mm-hmm. Opportunity is really key. There's a plethora of great resources, but creating that opportunity in the schools is absolutely key. And we're finding more research that bears out, and this is coming also from the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, and I know Helen Soule is presenting this afternoon too, that talks about a lot of the knowledge and skills we promote in civic learning are also paying off in kids' ability to be prepared for the business community too. The ability to work in diverse groups and solve problems, to critically think, to be able to talk about controversial issues, to garner resources. These are all very powerful civic skills that bear out in the business community in preparation for college and career. Can you talk a little bit about that synergy between readiness for college and career and readiness for civic life?
Sure.
Your thoughts on that?
I'm kind of living it right now because I have a son that just graduated from high school. And, one of the things that I think interferes with that is this new day and age of social media and texting. I mean, I look at my kids and they're constantly texting and doing those, and they get a little bit detached. And I think the governor made a good point about current events and making sure in the classroom that we're teaching that. But one thing that we did in Nevada, and I want to compliment one of our own ECS members who's a state senator in Nevada, Barbara Sagaski. Where are you, Barbara? Barbara was the prime sponsor of Senate Bill 163, an act relating to education, requiring elementary and secondary educational institutions to provide pupils with instruction in civics as part of the required instruction in American government, and providing other matters there too. And I was very proud to sign that bill for Barbara, and she was a true leader in that. And so part of that is making this part of the curriculum, but again, having the students and the kids be aware of what's going on around them, making them familiar with why it's important to vote, why it means something to serve on a jury. I mean, again, I have the benefit of having served in all three branches of government. And when I was a judge and I was looking at jury candidates and polling a jury, not a single one of them wanted to be there. And I used to tell them, I promise you, when this is all done, you are all going to be so thankful that you got to participate in this process. And it was true every time. But it's not just at school, it's at home. And I think every parent obviously has an obligation to set a good example, to go out and vote, and on voting day, to take their kids with them, or to make sure that they know that they're voting when there's an opportunity to do jury duty. Of course, they can't talk about the case at home, but they can come home and say, I'm participating in the democratic process and in this judicial process. Yeah. So it's really going to take a team effort to get that done.
I agree. And Governor, so talk some more with us about business skills, career college skills, and civic skills, how they kind of merge together in your mind.
And I think skills such as critical thinking, you learn in part by debating issues. Problem solving doesn't happen necessarily in a vacuum. And it's not only, I guess, civic life, but also civic virtue. You know, the same skills that one learns as they're debating an issue of the day, hopefully you can take it from the classroom to the community to the boardroom. It is part of the overall interaction that, okay, so this is foundational to what our country was and what the purpose of public education was, is to keep this Republican government, it's our Republican government, if what Franklin or whoever said, if you're going to keep it. But the skills that I think employers need, and as I'm out talking to companies, trying to get them to Montana, certainly it's competencies, but it's also these soft skills that frankly have a lot to do with a better appreciation of community and civics and actually debating and dialoguing with individuals.
Yeah, very good points. And there's a lot of discussion earlier today about assessment, accountability in schools. And I'm yet to meet any teacher administrator who says they don't like civic learning, they don't want to have it. But often there's a lot of policies set at state and federal levels that somehow unintentionally has marginalized this subject area greatly. And the data is bearing out the consequences of that, coming out of No Child Left Behind. All of these things have greatly marginalized. So if we could talk a minute about how state policy is important in this realm. You talked about this wonderful policy that you have moving forward, but how can that help strengthen civic learning, even if you're working from a ground-up local level?
Well, it's difficult because, now we're measuring in science, in math, and English, and even in Nevada, previously, we have a high school proficiency exam. You couldn't graduate unless you'd met the proficiency in those subjects. So obviously, a lot of the emphasis went on those issues, and unfortunately, some of the civics goes by the wayside, and that's why you have that flattening of that curve. So I think Senator Sagafsky's bill is going to go a long way in helping that. And then, we heard about it at lunch today. President Herczog, he's a perfect example of why kids should learn civics. I think every kid should watch his speech that he gave, or that presentation that he gave today, to inspire them. So I think it's and this is the great thing about ECS, is we have individuals from every state in the union who can come back and start to emphasize and make more policy with regard to bringing or emphasizing civics in our schools.
Mm-hmm. And I live in California, and we're finding that if it's not built into the assessment and accountability, like you say, it tends to be marginalized or treated as a frill or a fringe thing. And how do you elevate that? So policy is a big piece. Any suggestions you might have, Governor, on that?
Yeah, it was interesting. Last Friday, I was speaking at the 96th annual convention of the American Legion. And I had my prepared text and the like, and The average age, frankly, was probably 65, 70 years old, but at the start they got up and recited their Constitution. And it hit me enough that kind of throughout my speech, and I said, we need you more now than ever, because the very principles that this group are espousing is what we need every student to understand, because it really is about engagement. It's about understanding. I think that we could, certainly there were impacts by No Child Left Behind in what was prioritized and emphasized in our schools, but I don't think that we could scapegoat it and say the whole problem happened 12 years ago. I think that it's been a challenge much longer, and there's also a number of other influences, I think, impacting this. Policy at the state level can, I think, make an impact. Now, there are, back to our civics lessons of local control and the like, what can and can't be done. I'd say one shining spot in Montana, as an example, would be we have 8 Indian nations, within the interior boundaries of our state. And as part of, as you're looking at the new standards, the Common Core, part of that, the Montana-specific part, will be part of what's also enshrined in our Constitution, saying that there will be Indian education for all. My 6th grader has a better sense of Indian nations and governance and history and culture than I did growing up all throughout, actually growing up in Montana. So I think that there are those areas whereby individuals taking a leadership role, the impacts can be very, very significant and certainly lasting.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up Common Core, because it's a lot of conversation in states, even in states where they're not adopting it. At National Council for the Social Studies, we have established a publication. We published something called the College Career and Civic Life C3 Framework for Social Studies State Standards. We consider it our comparable document to Common Core for Social Studies. And what it does is it provides that link that you can work toward implementing Common Core, and it doesn't mean that you have to dismiss the social studies. You can do them together in a way that's rich, that's rigorous, that contextualizes the reason for reading and writing and listening and speaking. So there's ways to do it in ways that make sense and will help kids. So let me ask one final question, and then we'll ask a few questions, because our little clock is not sure of the time we have left, but we'll finish up quickly. So basically, in a nutshell, how would you define the civic mission of our schools? What would be your final message to our audience today?
I think part of it is what we've talked about. I mean, of course, we have to provide students what I call with the ladders toward a career or to college, but there's another ladder, is the civics one. And again, I think it's gotten lost in all this discussion in terms of these proficiencies in those basic areas. So I'm hopeful, at least in my state, that we're going to add and emphasize that civics piece to the curriculum and ensure that there's balance there, because that will make these students later on productive citizens. They're going to be voting, they're going to be, as I say, participating on juries, they're going to be volunteering, they're going to be doing great things in the community.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and if we go back to John Adams saying liberty, can't be preserved without general knowledge among the people. And they really thought that our public education system was what would provide that knowledge. I think we need to remember that and not get too far away from that. And if we really even look at the civic mission of what our schools can be, it's also preserving and understanding that liberty. Because those same, if a child starts here and the world's just around him, and certainly it expands over time, but at your very core, as your first grader, it's what is it about that child? It's what freedoms do you have? What can you have? as you expand to see a greater part of the community, I mean, you won't understand Janet Napolitano making the joke about now I can search your cell phones yesterday. She said that without really having that better, conceptual model and contextual model of what liberties are, where we begin that, and teach the students then from the broader sense. And I think that's probably we as educators need to have that laser-like focus on helping students understand that preserving liberty is important. We as governors and policymakers have to. And that's all part of, I think, the civic mission of what our educational system requires.
Okay, great answers. Thank you. We don't know where our young people will end up, if they'll go to college or not, what careers they'll follow or not, but they'll be in our American society. They should know how to operate in it. What kind of young people do we want in voting booths, serving in juries, as you mentioned? So it's an important piece. Okay, so do we have time for a question or two, or have we gone over?
We can take a question from the crowd. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Kathy Payne from State Farm. One of the things that our company promotes very strongly is service learning, but we're also very focused on young people being actively engaged in solutions and in creating change within their community. So I welcome your thoughts on what you may be doing in your states or recommendations you have, because as we're talking about civic learning, as we're talking about young people problem solving, I think it's hard to do that unless young people themselves are are sitting around the same tables that we are as adults. So I'd welcome any thoughts that you have on that.
I've always felt that it's important to get the kids out in the real world. And so I would like to see in the schools more internships and more practicums. And again, I can, from my observations, but as well as my own daughter. My own daughter, who's going to be a senior in high school, had the ability to work in an at-risk classroom. And it has opened her eyes in an amazing way. And before, I think it's part of the curse of being in a governor's family, they want to stay away from governments, but now she really wants to get involved because she sees firsthand what's happening. And I think if that's going to happen to her, it could happen to a lot of other kids. So I think we could do that through the schools to give them some internships and get some exposure to, as I say, the real world.
No, I think that's important as well. Maybe I'm becoming old and crusty, but it's sort of kids these days. You know, it seems like as I was a child, we'd actually go shovel our neighbor's sidewalk, and there was just an expectation of that. And there does seem to be more of a disconnect, so that we do have both to incent, provide the opportunities for kids to paint a Habitat for Humanity home or otherwise. In Montana, so we have the Governor's Office of Community Service that my wife and I are both involved in, and we look for what are those areas to involve not only college students and AmeriCorps, but even bringing it down that much further to provide the opportunities for students to engage. If those opportunities can't be sufficiently incented, I think schools should talk about this is part of what would be an expectation for an education and service to others.
Okay, thank you. One more question? Is there time? Is there a question?
What's the score now, Chair?
Yeah, that's the question of the day.
It's halftime right now. The score is
so we
0
can go all
to
day.
0. So we have time for probably one more question, and then we need to transition to the round tables, which are in the other room. So
Okay.
there's. Any closing remarks, Michelle?
I'm just thrilled that you're in the room and you're listening and you're dedicated to this and are thinking of ways to make sure that civic learning is still a core value in schools, because we need to be preparing kids for college, career, and civic life. So I thank you for the opportunity. I want to thank Paul Baumann, Ted McConnell, Susan Griffin from NCSS, and thank our panelists. What a joy for me to meet you and join in the conversation. So thank you.